Great. Good afternoon, everyone. And we are live here for you with our webcast on how can HR apply organizational neuroscience to impact business performance. And for those of you who caught that initial music, that was by one of our speakers, who I will introduce you in a few minutes. But welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this session. And thank you for that background score as well, Paul. We are live here for you with our I would request our speakers to be on mute, please. Organizational neuroscience to impact business performance. And for those of you who caught that initial music, that was by one of our speakers, who I will introduce you in a few minutes. But great. I think there was some echo around, but I could hear my own self. But I think we're good now. My name is Megha, and I'm from the People Matters team. And thank you all for joining us for this webcast. I was recently reading, of how neurobiology of behavior has huge implications for understanding and developing behaviors that are focused on achieving business performance. And which is why we feel it is very important for HR leaders to build capability in understanding and applying neuroscience principles. And that is what brings us here for today's conversation. Today's conversation is all about understanding why is it a business imperative to understand neuroscience principles, and what are some of the case studies to learn from, how organizations are successfully implementing learnings from neuroscience and reaping the benefits from it. We are really grateful to a partner for the day, Inagram, who've brought in their expertise and experience in crafting this conversation for today. So thank you so much, Vinita, Paul, and the entire team in helping us put together this conversation. And I would also like to take this opportunity to share a little bit about Inagram for those of you who may not have had the time to research a little bit about Inagram. Inagram is a consulting and research organization focused on creating a deeper understanding of the human mind and the drivers of behavior, and using that knowledge in the development of people and organizations. And as exciting as the topic is, we have experts with us today. And I take immense privilege in inviting our speakers for the day, Dr. Paul Brown, professor and award-winning author, organizational neuroscience, and Vinita Yadav, founder and director at Inagram. So before I hand it over to Dr. Paul and Vinita, let me just take this opportunity to share a little bit about our speakers for the day. Dr. Paul's main focus in the last few years has been on applying neuroscience to create a general theory of the individual and organizations. He consults and teaches in Southeast Asia, Europe, and America. He has co-authored several books that provide insights from neuroscience for organizations. And Vinita, from a senior large company HR background, Vinita founded Inagram to create added value for the new knowledge about the human mind and brain at work and in organizations of all kinds. During her corporate career, Vinita has worked with large Indian and multinational organizations on a wide variety of assignments spanning across culture and change, leadership development, inclusion and diversity, and talent management. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul and Vinita, for joining us today. We're really privileged to have you both with us. Welcome to this discussion.
Thanks a lot, Megha. And welcome, everybody. Good afternoon to all our participants. It's a very important topic that we are discussing today. And the fact that you all are here means that you would like to be ahead of the game. So congratulations for that.
Now, thank you so much, Vinita. Just before I hand it over to you, Vinita, just a quick housekeeping check for our audience. I know you will have a lot of questions because this topic is very exciting and interesting. So what we have done is we have saved some time for all of you for question and answers dedicated at the end of this discussion. But I won't stop you from asking questions in between. So keep them flowing in as and when they come to you. What you can do is, if you see on the screen on the right side, there is a chat box. So use the chat box to plug in your questions throughout the sessions. And once we've had the session by Dr. Paul and Vanita, we will pick up the questions from there and I will pose it to our speakers. So don't stop the questions coming in because we want to be packed with the questions right before we start with the Q&A session. And with that, without much further ado, over to you, Vanita, to take us forward with this session.
Thanks a lot. And I really hope that we do have a lot of questions, and I think we will because the topic is such, right?
Yes.
So, as I was saying, it's a very important topic. And let's look at HR from a historical perspective, right? HR is a relatively new function. New in the sense that it really used to be personnel management 30 years back. In some places, it is still personnel management. But in the last 30 years, the transition from personnel to HR has been quite fast. Especially if we look at the last decade and a half, the pace of change from being transactional to being transformational and being strategic has been very, very fast and accelerated. This is, of course, due to the fact that our environment has changed with amazing amount of speed. And every day there's a new change coming in with which we are grappling in the HR world and in the organizational world. Having said that, yes, now HR is becoming a strategic function. We are doing transformational work, especially in the last decade. It is still quite disappointing to see that we haven't really become a full member of boards in all the organizations. And you will recognize that, right? As HR professionals, we are interacting with leaders day in, day out. And in some places, we still don't really get our due. And if we ask why is that so, uh, I really believe that in part this is there because we haven't got a rigorous body of knowledge underneath our function. We have tools, we have techniques, but there's no certainty about those tools and techniques. We are doing something, uh, especially on the process side. But what is the knowledge base that we are using to build the foundation of the organization? That's a bit sketchy. And I think we can add a lot of depth to that base of knowledge. Neuroscience really gives us, as the HR function, the knowledge base to develop this as a profession and as a discipline, say like a discipline like law or finance. And that is the reason why it is imperative for HR professionals to understand this new knowledge and to apply this new knowledge and be at the forefront of transformation in their organization. Due to this, because we believe in this quite passionately, we founded Inagram to really research and practice the principles of applied neuroscience in organizations. We have also, Dr. Brown has also founded an international organization called the Iron Partnership, where there are a few founding members. Inagram is a part of it as well, which will do the research, create the tools, and create practices for organizations to follow. This is a pretty diverse team. There are people who are neuroscientists, there are executive coaches, there are HR practitioners. So it's a small group, but a very strong group. So that's really our agenda as HR and now applied neuroscientists in the making. I will hand over to Dr. Paul Brown now to take us through this session, which I know that you will find quite informative. And we'll take your questions at the end. And over to you, Paul. Paul, could you please unmute your speaker?
Good. I have unmuted my microphone.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here. It's part of the miracle of modern technology that I'm speaking to you from a very small country in Southeast Asia called Laos. And it's a country in which I am fascinated by how do you release the energies of a whole country. We're going to be talking today about how do you release energy inside organizations, because my underlying understanding now is that what we call profit is generated only by the way human energy has been applied inside corporate systems. And I'm going to come on to that in some more detail later on. What I'm going to do now is put a PowerPoint presentation up and share my screen so that we can get together around this PowerPoint. Let's try that again. Good. Always the anxiety for a presenter is he going to be able to make the technology work? But here we are. How can HR apply organizational neuroscience to impact business performance? Well, I thought we'd start out just by having a few thoughts about this extraordinary organ called the brain. There it is, about 2 kilograms in weight, sitting between your ears. There are 89 billion brain cells, 89. And they're making massively complicated pathways and connections. Each brain cell has the possibility of maybe 10,000 connections. And so it's that process of making those connections that makes each of us the individual that we are. All our brains are in principle the same, and all of them are completely different. And that's the extraordinary process for management. How do you get these brains walking in every day, focused properly on the strategic and operational goals of the organization? That's what I hope to give you some clues about in this presentation. Well, for those of you who are a bit squeamish about that, I won't leave it on too long, but there is a brain, two halves of it looking a bit like a rather oversized walnut. And just to amuse you, not long ago, a psychiatrist in New York decided that she would knit the brain. And this is a completely accurate representation of the brain split into its two halves. And if you can imagine folding those two halves together, we'd have a complete brain. You may see a little whitish squiggly line in the middle of the brain. That is in fact a zip that would join the two halves of the brain together. And the brain is in fact joined together by some fibers which link the two halves together. And it's one of the extraordinary things about the 21st century that we now have the capacity to image the brain in great detail. And what neuroscience is doing for us is something that psychology couldn't grapple with at all. What neuroscience is showing is how the brain works. Psychology attempted to find out by all kinds of devious and second-hand methods, but it couldn't image the brain. And what neuroscience is doing for us is actually showing us, and all sciences develop when you can get pictures of what you're doing. If you think of the way electron microscopy has produced images of what individual cells are doing, if you think of the way the great space telescopes are showing us things in space that previously we could only guess at, what neuroscience is doing for us is showing us how the brain works. Well, we are the only organisms in evolutionary history that can find things that are missing and conceptualize the result. So you'll see on the left-hand side here, there are 4 elements. This beautiful piece of carving that was done for me, you can see that air is the 4th one. And there it is represented by the air between the two, and by the fact that we can actually see what the letters might be, even though they're not there. That is an extraordinary capacity when you come to think about it. One of the things the brain does is prefer to see faces. Faces are hugely important. One of the things that I do in my own training programs with executive coaches is to say to them, when you've got a client coming to see you today, as you're getting ready for the day and you're in the bathroom and you're looking in the mirror, look in the mirror quite intently and say to yourself, is this a face I want to see today? Because the client who comes to see you sees your face. And the face conveys extraordinary amounts of information non-consciously to the observer. Here are these pretzels. all of them looking rather depressed and a bit unhappy and a bit miserable. Um, plugs in Southeast Asia, looking exactly like faces. We assign faces wherever we possibly can. So I wonder what you see in this face. And not to stay too long with it, if you tilt your head slightly to the right, you can see that it says the word liar. If you tilt your head backwards and to the left, it's much more difficult to see that word. And the instruction says, what do you read in this face? But actually, what the brain goes for straight is face. Concentrates on the face, not on the instruction to read. Well, here are some recent images of the brain. This is a neuroscientist and artist in America who has developed the most extraordinary technique for staining the brain with silver and with gold. And so in the top left and the top right, you can see a cross-section of the brain split in half, and to the left-hand side is the front part of the brain, the right-hand side is the back part of the brain. That rather flowery object, which is down in the left-hand corner of the four pictures, that area is where, when you've learned to ride a bike, that's where it's stored. Learn to walk with your own characteristic walk, that's where it's stored. That's the part of the brain which is extraordinarily important for the storing of things like swimming and walking and any other motor activity that we do. And then going down is the spinal cord, which we're not showing. Now, we do have to remember that the brain is in fact composed of three major parts: the brain itself, the heart, and the gut. And the heart and the gut are beginning to be areas of extraordinary significance as we begin to think about brain sciences. The most remarkable thing being perhaps the gut, because it's now understood that the millions of microbes that live in the gut have immense power to pass refined foods through into the bloodstream and get them to the brain, which affect the functioning of the brain very substantially. And so there's a lot of fascination in something called the microbiome, which is about the way the gut influences the brain. But we're going to be speaking today mostly about the stuff between the ears. We can now produce these extraordinary pictures of the brain. And we're at the beginning of a science. We don't actually know what they mean, except we can at last see this unbelievable tangle of fibers. And the red in between the two is what's called the corpus callosum, the bridge of fibers that transmits information between the two halves of the brain. We're going to come on to that a little later, because the way men and women use that and the quantity of fibers that they have is rather different. Women seem to have a kind of superhighway between the two halves, and for men it's a bit like a choked up country pathway. Men's capacity to function with the two working at the same time seems to be much less than women's, and the implications of that organization are very fascinating. Well, this is the way your brain looks right now, magnified 3,500 times. It's in a massive tangle of nerve cells and fibers, all interconnecting in a quite extraordinary way. And as science develops, we try to find new metaphors for the brain. So when I was a psychology student quite a long time ago, the metaphor that was used was that the brain was really a complex switchboard. Messages came from the outside world and were distributed internally. Messages came internally and were distributed to the outside world. Well, it's a very, very limited metaphor and completely too limited for modern use. Then, of course, as computers arrived, we began to think of the brain as a computer. What in fact the brain is a set of extraordinary number of parallel processing systems. And the brain has many differentiated parts. The front part of the brain is especially concerned with cognitive functions. The back part of the brain is connected to vision, particularly. The lobes behind the ears are particularly connected to language and emotion. on the top part of the brain and going slightly to the back, particularly concerned with fine motor action. But there are enormous numbers of highly differentiated parts of the brain, and yet, for each one of us, it looks as if it's a completely integrated system which puts it all together, and we speak coherently, we interact coherently, we function as if the whole thing was just a single system, when in fact it's an amazing number of very different systems that it manages to put together. Well, one of the great problems in organizations is how do you get different departments actually working together? How do you get their own interests aligned in terms of the organizational goals? How do you stop the fighting that goes on within departments? How do you create conditions in which the energy of people is really focused, not upon their own interest, but on their own interest aligned to the organizational interests? What if an organization was coherent in its different parts in the way that the brain is coherent? Well, this is perhaps the one slide, if you want to burn something into your own brains, that I would like you especially to remember. The best understanding we have of the brain, and though there's a fair bit of debate about it, nobody has come up with a better answer, is this thing called the triune, or the three-part brain. In 1975, a biologist asked the question, which is one of those deep, simple questions that pushes science forwards. He said, we've all been taught that mammals are special because they have live young. If we distinguish ourselves from snakes, the reptiles, we actually are the creatures that have live young. But he said, what happened to the brain when mammals started appearing in the world? Because the arrival of dependent young supposes that something must happen between the parent and the infant that takes care of the infant until it's old enough to take care of itself. In dogs, 4, 5, 6 months. Tigers and lions, about 2 years. In human beings, arguably 24 years. And certainly in the Western world, quite difficult to get 24-year-olds out of the family home altogether these days. There must be something, he said, in the brain which creates something called relationship. And what he began to suggest was there was a middle part of the brain called the limbic system, or the mammalian brain, which especially manages emotion and memory. So there we've got the brain stem down at the bottom there, the snake brain. You think of a snake, long spinal column, little brain on the top of it. It does everything to keep that animal alive. Same with alligators, same with crocodiles, same with all the reptiles. And we've got that still. And it does an enormous amount of work regulating all kinds of bodily functions for us. The way we wake, the way we sleep, perspiration, respiration, waking up to go to the loo in the middle of the night, all those kinds of things are being managed well below the threshold of consciousness all the time. And we only know about it when it goes wrong. And similarly, in the middle part of the brain, there's this huge area called the limbic system, which is managing essentially emotion and memory. And then, as evolution develops, we human beings acquire this extraordinary capacity to be able to think about ourselves, to be able to imagine the future, to be able to recall the past, and to create a language which, though some animals do have languages, so far as we know, none of them have developed the capacity to record their language in such a way that across continents and across centuries, thoughts can be transcribed and picked up by other people and discussed. And so we can even think about thinking, which is, when you come to think of it, a rather extraordinary process. Well, now, Western civilization has developed around the idea that fundamentally we control ourselves through our thinking. the great dictum of the French philosopher Descartes at the end of the 17th century was, I think, therefore I am. But what the modern brain sciences have shown us this century is that fundamentally our systems are driven not by our capacity to think, but by our capacity to feel, and our feelings are based upon our emotions. So in the middle part of the brain is the fundamental energy system. And if you hyphenate the word emotion into E-motion, energy creates action. Energy creates action. And so we have the opportunity, because of the modern applied neurosciences, to begin to rethink the whole of the motivational process. Many managers, when you really ask them what they understand about motivation, will default to the idea that actually it's a sticks and carrots game. Well, actually, what we know about the brain says that if you try sticks and carrots, the brain specially remembers the stick, and the carrot simply keeps the beast waiting for the next stick. It doesn't actually really direct people's energies in a positive kind of way. You can force people to behave in the way that you want to, but actually really good organizations don't force people. They create the conditions under which energy flows spontaneously and at its very best, joyously. And I want to talk about 3 of those kinds of organizations at the end of the session. So this is the way we now think about the brain, that information comes in and goes first to this extraordinary little structure called the amygdala. It's called the amygdala because the Greek word for almond, and there are 2 of these. Amygdala is a plural word, a bit like data. It's sometimes used singular and sometimes plural. There's another amygdala which is hidden by the mass of the limbic system. And what they are doing all the time is nanosecond by nanosecond checking on the environment for anything that in the first place might be concerned with danger. In the very small infant, and probably before the infant is born, there are assigning emotions to experience. And when the infant is born, for the first 3, 4, 5, maybe 18 years of life, the amygdala is very busy carving the pathways in which experience and emotion are getting associated. And it sends that information up into the cortex and creates the pathways. And we think now of feelings as being the compounds of emotion. So if you think of an artist, all the colors that an artist has available come from the 3 primary colors. And it's a mix of the 3 primary colors that creates the whole of the color spectrum. Well, it's a mix of the basic emotions, of which there are 8, that create the whole of the feeling system. And that's what drives our behavior. We now know that our brain, cognitively, our thinking brain, is really working out all the time what our brain has already decided. We are being run by our brains. We're not running our brains, we are being run by them. And that's a major shift in our understanding of human behavior. So what I want to do in the rest of this session is talk a little about what is this stuff called applied neuroscience, ANS. How is it relevant from a business perspective? What is the role of HR in using ANS? Why does it give us better answers? You can imagine I was rather pleased when I found that ANS and answers mix. And some organizational application stories. And then we'll have a Q&A called Applied Organizational Neuroscience. Well, it's the science of the new understanding of human behavior. I trained as a psychologist in the UK and a clinical and organizational psychologist, and practiced for many, many, many years, mostly in London, both as a clinical psychologist and eventually as an organizational psychologist. What I bit by bit began to feel was very dissatisfied with what psychology told me. And as we began to be aware of the applied neurosciences beginning to emerge especially with Daniel Goleman's book called Emotional Intelligence in 1996, 97. And I had the opportunity to bring Daniel Goleman to the UK for his first public lectures. And reading his work made me understand that he'd seen something very profound, which is the neurosciences were going to tell us things about human beings that psychology didn't. And I now think of 20th century psychology as being like a set of theologies. It's what psychologists believe, not what they can demonstrate. And it's not that they sometimes don't speak the truth, it's that we have no method in psychology of working out what the truth might be in a scientific sense. So Freudians and Jungians have a different view of the way the human being works. Gestalt psychologists have a different view. Transactional psychologists have a different view. There are, in fact, 43 different schools of psychology in the 20th century. And as I say, some of them may have truths in them, but we don't know how to sort out which are true and which are not. What 20th century neuroscience is telling us is that the master controller of all our behavior is the brain. We're not fundamentally psychological beings. We are energy systems. And applied neuroscience turns that knowledge into organizational value. Well, let's have a look at a person who's doing an amazing leadership job.
Talking about expectations. Watch. Okay.
So, a very simple demonstration, but I think extraordinarily interesting, that he can get an audience of 200 or 300 people doing something they would never even imagine doing. And I think it's a very interesting, short example of leaving them with the feeling that they got there. And I think that's real leadership. So what underpins all that? Well, if we get it down to its simplest, it's enough information, the right kind of energy, and trust. And there's a lot of fascination in organizations these days about the nature of trust. one of the dilemmas of it is people want to start measuring it. Well, I think that's a profound error. An HR director came to me some months ago and said they knew that trust was rather poor in the organization. They'd like it to be better. Could I help? I said, sure, but I'd like you to do something for me first. He said, well, what's that? So I said, well, I'm going to send you a little questionnaire during the course of the day. And if you take it home and give it to your wife this evening, I think you'll understand how we can go about measuring trust. And he said, what's the questionnaire about? And I said, oh, it's going to be find out if she loves you. And he said, you must be mad. I said, absolutely. Because if he'd done that, his wife would either have laughed or been very angry with him. And when we start trying to measure some things about the nature of human experience, we turn them into transactional processes when in fact they are so fundamental to our well-being that it completely starts the process of wrecking them. So I'm beginning to suggest that the future of HR is about managing the flow of information and energy and trust-based relationships. Complex mix, but for the first time, we've got a description of the way the mind works. And this is hugely important because psychology left mind to the philosophers. Psychology decided early on you couldn't experiment in any way on the mind, so it wasn't going to bother with it. Well, a wonderful neuroscientist in University College of Los Angeles called Dan Siegel suggested about 6 years ago that perhaps we could begin to think about mind as the way the brain organizes itself around the flow of information, the management of its own and the rest of the body's energy, and the way it transmits energy to other people, and the quality of relationship. Now, when you look at that, what we've done in 20th century, second half 20th century organizations is we've maxed on information, we're exhausted with information. We've done almost nothing about understanding energy except sending people to the gym. And we've commercialized relationships in that we've required people to behave in organizations within protocols, which makes them stifle their natural capacity to manage relationships and behave in ways that are required of them. That takes energy. And that takes energy away from the main goals of the organization. So I'm suggesting that there's a very fundamental question for HR in working out what kind of an organization you want to have. When we ask that question from an applied neuroscience perspective, the choices are either a mindless organization, a process-driven organization, which everyone is required, a bit like apples in a great international grocery store. Everything is put in plastic, looks rosy, is designed to keep as long as possible. Homogeneity. Let's have everybody the same. But actually, everybody inside organizations is different. It's the differences that are the great joy and that we need to harness. But if we try and make everybody the same, we're trying to stop their minds functioning. And we can do that very efficiently, but we get a mindless organization. Or we can have a clear-minded organization. It's difficult to find the opposite of mindless because mindful has been absolutely the prerogative of the mindfulness movement. So clear-minded is what I think we want good organizations to be. Well, how is this relevant from a business perspective? So there are two big propositions that Innogram wants to offer to you in thinking about at least the next decade and perhaps quite a long way forward from there. This is the new science for redefining HR and to create a completely new way of thinking about organizational behavior. Professionally, I think HR is not in a very happy position in some ways, and it's trying to redefine itself. We see things like this time, performance reviews, why we hate them, and what you can do about it. Or there's a lot of rebranding going on. A big piece in Harvard Business Review last year 5 new titles for HR, it was called. And here are the 6 most creative new HR job titles: Chief Happiness Officer, Culture and Geek Resource Manager, Director of Talent, Office Happiness Champion, Head of Optimistic People. HR needs a new base from which to define its own and the organization's future. So if 20th century psychology completely failed HR, it didn't deliver on its promise of being the science of human behavior, it has served HR very badly, then applied neuroscience, I think, gives HR a new knowledge base from which to redefine its credentials in the organization. And so here are 3 pieces of applied neuroscience knowledge, and I think they're of great value, both to the organization and in resetting the knowledge base of HR. The first is that human beings are essentially energy systems, not psychological systems. As I said at the beginning, the outcome, profit, is a statement of the way energy has been applied in the system. Any outcomes rely on human energy. So what about taking a serious look at mindlessness inside the organization, the mindless uses of energy, and divert what is saved to real value creation? All decisions are based on emotion. It's why people get so locked into their own point of view. We are not rational systems, we are rationalizing systems. And for competent people, the best bet is to believe their own brain rather than someone else's. That's why organizational change programs are so difficult. Partly because the brain doesn't want to waste resources, partly because it's easier to go on doing what we've always been doing, and partly because why should we trust somebody else's view unless they've hooked our emotional system in such a way that, of course, we're saying, absolutely yes, let's get on with it. And so HR needs to know what the basic emotions are and how they work and how the whole of the feeling system can be properly mobilized. And the third thing is that human beings are self-regulating systems. How does a leader get energy focused on the strategic and operational goals of the organization so that these self-regulating systems called people gladly give of their best? And then here's a 4th bit. What if women's brains, men's and women's brains work differently? And they do, very differently. So how is HR going to cope with that knowledge? It's a great opportunity. So what is the role of HR in using applied neuroscience, and why does it give better answers? Well, the point that we're making is that HR has the opportunity to have real science underpinning its practices and to develop its practices from real science. So that, like medicine, it goes on improving as a knowledge-based, not just a practice-based profession. You know, there was a time when barbers and surgeons were all part of the same guild. Henry VIII made a guild of the barber surgeons. But as medicine in the 18th century began to be more and more science-based, by the beginning of the 19th century, there was a need to work out that barbers and surgeons were rather different, and people had to choose between being barbers or surgeons. And the Royal College of Surgeons in London was developed, and models of the same kind around the world. Well, I think the time is coming when a number of professions, executive coaching is one, and I think HR is another, where we can start raising the question, do you want to be barbers or do you want to be surgeons? Do you want to be the kind of HR which is a cut above the old practices of we do it because everybody else does it this way and it's technique driven? Do we want to make it knowledge driven? And so I think applied neuroscience is going to give better answers because they can be continuously questioned and researched. Well, very quickly, a minute on each of 3 different companies. So this is a retail company in America called Pirch, P-I-R-C-H, founded 7 years ago after 2 years of thought by its founder, who was being coached by a person with some knowledge about the way the brain worked. He had a very bad experience. He'd left the Midwest, having made a small fortune in real estate, to go and live in California, build the house that he wanted, and have a different style of life. And in building his house, he found it was extraordinarily difficult to get a real understanding of equipping his kitchen and bathrooms, and being California, an outdoor barbecue, in the way that he wanted. He could go to a store and they would try to sell him a bath or a basin or taps or a shower, but nothing felt as if it could be put together very easily. Or you could go to a store where there was just one brand, you couldn't try anything. And so he decided he would set up a store which was completely different. And his first store was 30,000 square feet of space, big single floor. And going into it, everything worked. You can turn the showers on, they work. You can vary the heat, they work. You can take the plug out of the bath, the water runs away. You open a fridge, the food is there, the light come on. And his most important employees turned out to be chefs, because you could book in to have a session with the chef to try different kinds of cooking equipment and different kinds of cooking appliances. He's now got 7 stores across America, each of the same sort of size. Nobody in his stores is allowed to sell. They're wonderfully informed. They're very effective in advising, but people come just for the experience. They spend a long time. In one of his stores, he's got a whole area which has got 5 shower suites and 4 bathrooms in it. The whole family can come. They can make the whole area completely private. The family can try things out, working out what it is they really want. Of course, people lift their aspirations and expectations. And he follows through, of course, by making sure the installations are up to the standards that the experience delivers. So in 7 years, only Tiffany and Apple outsell him on a value per square foot basis now. And he didn't set out to do that. He simply set out to develop a shop which was based upon the principle not of attracting people to his stores, but attaching people to his idea. Financial services companies often spend huge amounts of money getting in new people, but people drop out of their company almost as fast as they come in. And the overheads for getting new customers in many financial services companies like insurance. The trick is to attach people, not just to attract them. Then a building company in the UK. It's a privately owned company. The present chairman inherited it from his father. His father gave up being chairman when he was 87. He ran it in a very autocratic fashion. He developed it in 1945 and ran it until 20 years ago. The son, when he inherited, decided he would change the style of the company completely. And bit by bit has developed a style in which he deliberately sets out to give authority as low as possible in the organization. He makes people feel that it's their company, it's their responsibility. He takes no major decisions. He challenges executive decisions, but authority lies with the people who are employed. Of course, as shareholder, he could in the end intervene, but he chooses not to. He lets people make their mistakes and they learn. And he's got an amazingly successful company, which 5 years in a row has been judged the best house builder in the southeast of England. And he wrote me a charming email about 5 months ago saying that he'd been doing this just because he knew it made sense to release the energies of people. And he hadn't thought of it like that, but that's what he's been doing. And he said rather wonderfully, your recent book called The Fear-Free Organization has sprinkled stardust on what I've known but haven't had words for. So that was very sweet of him. And then a financial services company in the UK, a trading company. Now, you all have an idea of people at desks trading. A human being can make good decisions in front of a screen at about every 2 seconds. Modern algorithms can not only monitor everything that your competitors are doing worldwide, but can make buy-sell decisions at the rate of 150,000 a second. It's extraordinary. So the question is, how are good companies going to attract people? What this company in London has decided over the last 3 years is going to attract people on the quality of relationship that they have. And one of the things this financial company does is share all its information with all its employees all the time. It trusts them. hugely. And they're producing results of a kind that even the regulator is visiting to say, we don't know what you're doing, but it's remarkable. Can you tell us what it is you're doing? And the chief executive says, actually, it's because we like people. They get rid of people who are viruses. They get rid of people who set their own systems in place and start wrecking the trust-based relationships they've established. So here are some reference resources. Books that I've done over the last 5 years, which have been my gradual evolving thoughts about how we can get this fascinating stuff called applied neuroscience into the working world. And that's why Vanita has set up Innogram, which is, let's get this stuff working. And now we can have some Q&A.
Thank you, Paul. And Megha, over to you. Could you let us know what are the questions that we are getting?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul and Vinita, for that very, very interesting session. I could see viewers glued onto the session during the entire talk that Dr. Paul you just gave. So I think the questions have started flowing in. One of the questions that came in, so Dr. Paul, you've already touched upon it, and maybe we could just deep dive a little in it. The question says, how can all the knowledge and understanding of brain be applied while making HR strategies? Any specific example that you can share?
A fundamental question for HR is, how does this organization regard people? Are they actually there and you're paying them and actually you really think they're not really worth it, but you don't know what to do with them? You don't trust them fundamentally. Or are you going to set up systems in which you profoundly trust people? And if you profoundly trust people, you have completely different relationships. And if people say, well, how do we go about trusting people? The answer is, you trust them. And the extraordinary thing about it is it's an absolute. You can't have bits of trust. You trust. And if you trust, there are huge implications. The best writing on this is a book called Reinventing Organizations. I remember the author in just a minute, and perhaps Vanita might.
It's Frederick Laloux.
Thank you very much. Laloux, L-A-L-O-U-X. He's got some theory in the book which I think is not terribly good, but his field work is wonderful. He went out to find organizations that had reinvented themselves. And he describes a number of organizations, an engineering organization of 40,000, service organization in Holland running domiciliary care services, excuse me. And he describes how these organizations run themselves on the basis of letting the decisions happen right down the chain. People feel engaged, involved, that it's their company. Energy flows. People come to work because the relationships at work are worth coming for. We know that many organizations have people in them where they come to work very unwillingly, and they spend the day at work feeling that, God, it's the last place they want to be. And yet, if they were to go on holiday, energy flows. Well, how about having that energy coming to work? So the starting point would be to ask the question, fundamentally, do we trust people? Another question.
Yes, Dr. Paul, we have our next question. The question is, can you talk more about how we are not rational systems, but rationalizing systems?
It's a profound shift in our attempt to understand this extraordinary stuff called human behavior. If we were rational systems, we would not be able to make extraordinary decisions, because extraordinary decisions come from awarenesses that the system itself could not have developed until a particular person comes to an extraordinary conclusion. So the problem, we're touching here on artificial intelligence and machine learning and a number of things of that kind. But what's absolutely clear is that what gives meaning in our life is the way emotion gets attached to experience. That's how our lives have color in them. And at the moment, by and large, computers do not have lives that have color in them. So they're amazingly able to make decisions at very high rate once they have been programmed. Our programming is of such a kind that it is continuously adaptable, but different for each of us. And there are times when an individual inspires other people in such a way. Let's think of Mahatma Gandhi, extraordinary capacity to mobilize the energy of other people in a way that was quite different from anything that anybody else had seen in the process of getting rid of imperial colonial rule. And you know, the British at the time had no method of dealing with it. They couldn't work out how you could do something that actually didn't require people to fight, but just be. And in a way, that's what the new science of human behavior is going to be about. It's how do we mobilize the energy of people in a way that actually they feel completely engaged with what they are doing.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. The next question coming in is, what are some of the biggest challenges in applying neuroscience in HR?
Shifting the mindset of HR people. You know, all of us professionally get stuck with what we know. And when we think something works, we want to stay with it. And HR, as a very close observer over it of many, many, many years, HR has developed as what is in fact a technique-driven profession, and is a bit subject to the latest fad. And one of the difficulties that happens in HR is people down the line in the operating side of the organization get weary of the next HR fad. And though they'll be good corporate citizens and they'll do what HR tells them to do, probably, they don't feel that it necessarily adds up a lot. Now, it's true of psychology and all psychological therapies, as it is of HR, that we haven't had an agreed working model of the human being. And so we haven't really been able to have a serious discussion about what it is we should do. What I'm suggesting that applied neuroscience is beginning to offer us is a working model of a human being, which says it's an energy system, like the rest of the universe. Psychology missed out on this completely. I went through many of the main psychology textbooks of the last 50 years at one time to see whether energy appeared in the index. And fundamentally, energy did not appear in the index in any meaningful way. It wasn't thought of as being relevant to human beings because they were psychological systems. But we say, where does all the energy come from? And it comes from the way that experience has been attached to E-motion and creates the person that we are, ready to attach to something that is worthwhile. So how do we make organizations worthwhile? We make them worthwhile because of the avowed purpose of the organization and the quality of relationships inside them. Somebody is asking a question about the return of investment. Can I just mention that very much? The evidence that's accumulated so far, and it's quite slight because there hasn't been much of it, but is hugely clear and consistent that once people start working on the basis of seriously feeling trusted, with capacity to make decisions in which they are properly supported, profits flow. It creates the most extraordinary change in the dynamic of the organization. So the organization is not driven for the sake of money. The organization is driven for the sake of the human qualities of doing something with our lives that are worthwhile, with relationships that are worth having, and properly managed, money comes out the other end. There we are. I think we've come to an end, apart from your wind-up, Meg.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. We have a lot more questions coming in, but unfortunately, I'm a little conscious about everyone's time. And we just have 1 more minute left. So what we will do is we will pick up, compile all the questions that have come in and send it your way to answer them via email maybe. And then we can send it back to all our participants.
I look forward to it. Thank you. And Vanita, I just speak. I'm sorry I didn't bring you in properly.
No, Paul, it's always wonderful to listen to you. And we've been now working together for a few years. And every time you talk about this topic, I'm still all ears. The only, I will just add while concluding to the last question on the return on investment, right? All HR professionals now know, have built the case, and this is just one small example of engaging employees, right? Nobody will now ask that question, what is the return on investment? What neuroscience is talking about is attaching people to the organization. That has a far more powerful impact than engagement, a far more powerful impact. So that's the value that neuroscience can bring. And as I said, that's just a small example. We will get back to you. We will get the questions from Megha, and we will revert to you with answers to your questions. And thank you all for joining. It was wonderful being here.
And thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinita, and thank you so much, Dr. Paul, for taking our time and taking this session for our audience. The fact that we're a little over time and still the audience is glued to this session just shows how interesting this topic is. So thank you, both of you, for taking this session. And thank you, each one of you who's still glued onto this session and have made this session so interesting and so engaging by putting in questions and being as enthusiastic as ever as an audience. So thank you so much, all of you. And I'd also like to thank our partner, Innergram, for helping us put this conversation together and making it so exciting. So thank you so much. All of you who are there viewing us right now, you will receive a feedback link from us. So please do fill in your comments or thoughts on this session so that we can raise the bar next time and bring more and more such interesting and valuable conversations to all of you. So with that, we conclude our session for the day. Thank you and have a great evening ahead. Bye-bye.